Picture yourself standing at the mouth of a narrow mountain pass somewhere in the rugged highlands of medieval Japan. The wind cuts through the cold air, carrying the distant sound of marching feet. Below you stretches a sight that would shake even the bravest commander, an army so vast it seems to swallow the valley itself. 30,000 soldiers advancing slowly through the mountains, their banners rising like a forest of spears. And behind you? Fewer than 500 men. No reinforcements. No safe road out. No chance of rescue. Most leaders in history would have chosen survival. They would have retreated into the mountains, scattered their forces, or negotiated for mercy. But the samurai who stood at that pass made a very different decision. He looked out at the overwhelming army before him and chose to hold the line anyway. Not because he believed victory was likely, but because surrender was something he simply could not accept. In a world defined by honor, loyalty, and duty, some lines were never meant to be crossed. So here's the question that has echoed through Japanese history for centuries. What happens when a handful of warriors stand against an army 60 times their size? Could a few hundred samurai really slow down 30,000 soldiers? Or was this stand destined from the beginning to become one of history's most tragic and unforgettable acts of courage? Welcome to Ancient Storybook, a place where forgotten warriors and lost battles come back to life. If you enjoy powerful stories from the past that reveal what human beings are truly capable of, make sure to subscribe and join us. Because the story you're about to hear is not just about a battle, it's about the moment a single decision turned a doomed stand into legend. To understand why a samurai commander would willingly face an army tens of thousands strong, you have to step back into the world that shaped his choices. 14th century Japan was not the peaceful, orderly society many people imagine when they think of samurai culture. It was a nation fractured by power struggles, political betrayal, and a brutal civil war that tore the country into competing factions. For generations, real power in Japan had belonged not to the emperor in Kyoto but to military rulers known as shoguns. These men commanded armies, controlled land, and governed through networks of powerful warlords. In the early 1300s, however, that delicate balance collapsed. The emperor at the time, Go-Daigo, believed the imperial throne should once again rule Japan directly. Determined to restore authority to the crown, he launched an ambitious political movement aimed at dismantling the military government that had dominated the country for decades. At first, it seemed like his gamble might actually work. Several influential samurai leaders sided with the emperor, believing they were helping restore a more legitimate order. Among those leaders was a powerful warrior named Ashikaga Takauji. But history often turns on decisions that look very different in hindsight. After helping defeat the existing regime, Takauji made a move that shocked the political world of Japan. Instead of strengthening the emperor's rule, he turned his armies against the imperial court itself and seized power. Takauji established what would become known as the Ashikaga shogunate, placing himself at the center of a new military government. From a strategic perspective, it was a masterstroke. Powerful regional lords quickly aligned themselves with the new shogun in exchange for land, protection, and political influence. Within a few years, the Ashikaga system controlled vast portions of Japan. But power gained through force rarely goes uncontested. Emperor Go-Daigo refused to accept defeat. Rather than submit to the new shogunate, he fled south and established a rival imperial court. This division split the country into two competing governments: the northern court, supported by the Ashikaga regime, and the southern court, loyal to the emperor who refused to surrender his claim to legitimacy. What followed was decades of conflict that historians now call the Nanbokucho period, one of the most turbulent chapters in Japanese history. Armies marched across provinces. Alliances shifted constantly. Castles changed hands again and again. For ordinary people, it meant instability and violence. For samurai, it meant choosing a side in a war where loyalty often mattered more than survival. And this is where our story begins to take shape. Among the warriors who remained fiercely loyal to the southern court was a family whose reputation for devotion and courage had already become legendary: the Kusunoki clan. Their loyalty to the emperor was not political convenience. It was a matter of identity, honor, and personal conviction. In a war where many commanders change sides to secure power or protect their lands, the Kusunoki name became synonymous with something far rarer: unbreakable loyalty. It was from this family, shaped by sacrifice and raised in the shadow of civil war, that the young samurai who would one day stand before 30,000 enemies first learned what it meant to fight for a cause larger than his own life. History often remembers great battles, but the forces that shape those moments usually begin much earlier, in quieter and more personal places. Long before he stood at a mountain pass facing an army that outnumbered his own by tens of thousands, the young samurai who would become known as Kusunoki Masetsura was growing up in the shadow of a man whose reputation already echoed across Japan. His father, Kusunoki Masashige, was one of the most respected warriors of his era and a fierce supporter of Emperor Go-Daigo. In a time when many samurai shifted loyalties depending on who held power, Masashige became famous for something far rarer: absolute devotion to the imperial cause. He was not only a capable battlefield commander but also a brilliant strategist who understood how to use terrain, timing, and patience against larger forces. Even his enemies respected his mind for war. But what truly defined Masashige was his willingness to sacrifice everything for loyalty. In 1336, during the decisive Battle of Minatagawa, he found himself facing overwhelming Ashikaga forces. He knew the odds were terrible. According to historical accounts, he even advised the emperor to avoid a direct confrontation because the situation was strategically hopeless. When that advice was rejected, Masashige did not abandon the cause. Instead, he accepted his fate and marched into battle anyway, fully aware he would not return. Before leaving for that final fight, he spoke to his young son, Masetsura. The conversation has been remembered for centuries because of its quiet, emotional weight. Rather than bringing the boy with him into a doomed battle, Masashige sent him home. He told him, "Grow stronger. Continue the fight when the time comes." In that moment, a father who knew he was walking toward death placed the future of his family's honor in the hands of a child. For Masetsura, that farewell became the defining memory of his life. Growing up without his father meant that Masetsura inherited more than just a famous name. He inherited a legacy. Across Japan, people spoke of Kusunoki Masashige as the perfect example of samurai loyalty. His story was already becoming legend, and with that legend came an unspoken expectation that his son would carry the same spirit forward. That kind of legacy can crush a person, or it can forge them into something extraordinary. As Masetsura matured, he did not attempt to escape the shadow of his father's reputation. Instead, he stepped directly into it. He trained as a warrior, studied the same strategies that had made his father so formidable, and committed himself to the same cause that had cost Masashige his life. By the time he reached adulthood, the civil war between the Ashikaga shogunate and the southern court was still raging, and loyalist forces desperately needed capable commanders. Masetsura emerged as one of them. He was not simply fighting to win battles. In many ways, he was fighting to honor a promise made years earlier between a father and a son. And as the war grew more desperate, that promise would lead him toward a moment where courage, loyalty, and sacrifice would collide in one of the most dramatic stands in Japanese history. By the time Kusunoki Masetsura began leading forces of his own, he understood a hard truth that every experienced commander eventually learns: war is rarely won by numbers alone. Terrain, timing, and strategy can often matter far more than the size of an army. In the rugged landscape of medieval Japan, this reality was especially true. Much of central Japan is defined by steep mountains, dense forests, and narrow valleys that twist through the countryside like natural corridors. For large armies, this geography could quickly turn from an advantage into a nightmare. Moving thousands of soldiers through mountain terrain required careful coordination, steady supply lines, and wide roads that simply didn't exist in many regions. A force that looked unstoppable on an open plain could become slow, vulnerable, and disorganized when forced into tight mountain routes. Masetsura understood this better than most commanders of his time. He had grown up hearing stories of how his father had used Japan's natural landscape as a weapon, and he studied those lessons carefully. Instead of trying to meet larger armies in wide, open battles where sheer numbers would crush his forces, Masetsura focused on controlling the terrain. The mountains became his greatest ally. One of the most powerful defensive positions in that kind of environment is a narrow mountain pass. To modern eyes, it might look like nothing more than a winding road between steep slopes. But in military terms, it can be a force multiplier of enormous importance. When a large army approaches a pass, its soldiers cannot advance in massive formations. The terrain forces them into tight columns where only a small number of fighters can engage at one time. This simple fact changes everything. If 500 defenders position themselves correctly inside a narrow pass, they are not truly fighting 30,000 enemies at once. Instead, they are facing only the few dozen or hundred soldiers who can physically reach the front line at any given moment. The rest of the army is trapped behind them, waiting, unable to bring its full strength to bear. For a smaller force, that bottleneck can make survival possible. Matsutsura used this principle repeatedly during the long struggle between the Southern Court loyalists and the Ashikaga regime. Rather than committing to large-scale battles that favored the enemy, he developed a style of warfare that modern historians often describe as a form of early guerrilla strategy. His men would strike quickly, using their knowledge of mountain trails and hidden routes to launch sudden attacks on enemy units. Then, before a larger force could respond, they would disappear back into the forests and highlands. To Ashikaga commanders, this kind of resistance was incredibly frustrating. They possessed larger armies, better resources, and the backing of powerful regional lords, yet they often found themselves chasing an opponent who refused to fight on predictable terms. Matsutsura's forces knew the mountains intimately. They could move faster through difficult terrain, choose their battlegrounds carefully, and exploit the natural defensive advantages of the landscape. Over time, the mountains of Japan became something like a living fortress for the Southern Court resistance. Every ridge, valley, and narrow trail could potentially become part of the battlefield. For years, Matsutsura used these tactics to delay and disrupt forces far larger than his own. But even the most brilliant strategy cannot hold back a rising tide forever. As the Ashikaga shogunate consolidated power and gathered larger armies, the pressure on the remaining loyalist strongholds grew heavier with each passing year. Eventually, Matsutsura would face a moment where all his understanding of terrain and strategy would lead to one final decision. And that decision would place him and a few hundred warriors directly in the path of an army tens of thousands strong. The moment eventually arrived when strategy, geography, and sheer determination would collide in a single place. Word reached Kusunoki Matsutsura through scouts and informants that a massive Ashikaga force was advancing toward the region. This was not a routine patrol or a small punitive expedition. It was a full military campaign, a coalition army assembled with one clear objective: crush the remaining resistance of the Southern Court once and for all. The numbers alone were staggering. Some accounts suggest the approaching army numbered close to 30,000 soldiers. By comparison, the force available to Matsutsura was tiny, somewhere between 300 and 500 men depending on the source. Even in an era when warriors were accustomed to fighting against overwhelming odds, the imbalance bordered on the absurd. Yet Matsutsura did not retreat. Instead, he chose a position that reflected everything he had learned about war in the mountains of Japan. A narrow pass cut through the rugged terrain ahead of the advancing army, a natural choke point where the steep slopes pressed tightly around the path. It was the kind of place where large forces could not easily spread out or maneuver. For most commanders, it might have seemed like a last resort. For Matsutsura, it was an opportunity. When the Ashikaga soldiers began pushing into the pass, they quickly discovered they were not marching into open ground. The defenders had taken the high positions along the slopes and fortified the narrow corridor as best they could. Archers lined the elevated ground. Spears waited behind crude barricades. Every rock, tree, and bend in the path became part of the defense. From the perspective of the attacking army, the situation was deeply frustrating. 30,000 soldiers meant very little when the terrain allowed only a handful to reach the front lines at any given moment. The long columns of troops stretching behind them could do nothing but wait while the first wave collided with the defenders. And collide they did. The fighting inside that mountain corridor was brutal and relentless. This was not the kind of clean battlefield maneuvering often portrayed in films. It was close, chaotic combat fought within a confined space where every yard of ground had to be taken by force. Arrows rained down from above. Spears thrust forward from behind defensive lines. When those weapons failed, swords and daggers took their place. The narrow terrain made everything harder. Fallen soldiers could not easily be removed from the battlefield, and the ground quickly became slick and treacherous. Men struggled to keep their footing while fighting at arm's length with enemies determined to break through. Every step forward by the attackers came at a cost. For Masetsura's warriors, the situation was clear. There was no easy path of retreat and no illusion about the odds they faced. But they were fighting for something deeper than survival. These were men who had chosen their loyalty to the southern court knowing full well that the political winds had turned against them. Many had already accepted that their cause might ultimately fail. That knowledge did not weaken their resolve, it hardened it. Hour after hour, the defenders held the pass. Each wave of Ashikaga soldiers pushing forward met a wall of resistance that refused to break. In purely strategic terms, every moment the defenders delayed the enemy bought precious time for the struggling loyalist movement elsewhere. But battles like this are rarely decided by courage alone. No matter how fierce the defense, the sheer weight of numbers pressing forward could not be held back forever. The struggle in that narrow mountain pass was only the beginning of a far larger confrontation, one that would soon force Masetsura and his warriors into a final stand remembered for centuries. The desperate defense in the mountain pass was only one chapter in a struggle that had been building for years. Kusunoki Masetsura had managed to slow the advance of much larger forces more than once, but the larger reality of the war was closing in. The Ashikaga shogunate commanded enormous resources, loyal regional warlords, and armies that could be replenished again and again. The southern court, by contrast, was slowly running out of time, men, and supplies. Eventually, the conflict moved toward what would become the defining moment of Masetsura's life, the Battle of Shijo Newat in the year 1348. By this point, the imbalance of power had become even more severe. Masetsura and his allies could gather perhaps several hundred warriors, maybe 700 at most if every available fighter was counted. Facing them was an Ashikaga army that some historical estimates place near 60,000 men under the command of one of the shogunate's most capable generals. The outcome, from a purely military standpoint, seemed almost predetermined. But before the armies met, something happened that would echo across centuries of Japanese history. Masetsura and his warriors traveled to a temple known as Shitenoji. There, in a quiet moment before the coming battle, they performed an act that revealed exactly what kind of decision they had made. On the wooden door of the temple, Masetsura carved a poem, a traditional samurai death poem, written by someone who knows the end of his life is approaching. Alongside it, he carved his name. Then the other warriors stepped forward. One by one, they carved their names beside his. More than 140 names were etched into that temple door. Each one represented a man who understood the reality of the coming battle and had accepted it fully. This was not a message to their enemies. It was not a plea for rescue. It was a declaration. These men were not expecting to survive, and they wanted history to remember who had stood there together. That door still exists today, a silent witness to one of the most solemn moments in samurai history. Soon afterward, the armies met at Shijo Newat. Unlike the narrow mountain pass where terrain had helped the defenders, this battlefield offered far fewer advantages. The Ashikaga forces were able to deploy their strength more effectively, surrounding and pressing the smaller loyalist army from multiple directions. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Masetsura and his brother Masatoki fought alongside their men as the battle closed in around them. Despite their courage, the numerical advantage of the Ashikaga army eventually became overwhelming. One by one, the loyalist warriors fell, their resistance collapsing under the relentless pressure of a force nearly 100 times larger. Masetsura himself was gravely wounded during the battle. At that moment, he faced the final decision that defined the samurai code he had lived by his entire life. For many warriors in medieval Japan, capture was considered a fate worse than death. Surrender meant humiliation, the loss of honor, and the possibility of being displayed as a trophy by the enemy. Instead, samurai often chose to end their own lives through ritual suicide rather than allow their fate to be decided by someone else. As the battle reached its final moments, Masetsura and his brother followed that tradition. Rather than surrender to the Ashikaga forces, they took their own lives on the battlefield, dying according to the code they had sworn to uphold. Militarily, the Ashikaga army had won a decisive victory that day. But the manner in which Masetsura and his warriors faced their end ensured that the story of Shijo Newat would never be remembered as a simple defeat. It became something far more powerful, a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and the extraordinary resolve of people who chose honor even when they knew the outcome could only be tragic. As the smoke of the battlefield faded and the clash of steel finally fell silent, the story of Kusunoki Masetsura did not end with his death. In many ways, it was only the beginning. For centuries afterward, his name would echo through Japanese culture as a symbol of loyalty, courage, and unwavering commitment to a cause greater than oneself. In temples, history books, and classrooms across Japan, Masetsura's final stand has been remembered not simply as a battle lost, but as a testament to the power of honor. What makes his story so powerful is not the scale of the defeat, but the spirit behind it. Faced with impossible odds, Masetsura and his warriors chose conviction over survival. They stood their ground knowing the outcome, embracing the values that defined the samurai way: loyalty to one's lord, courage in the face of death, and honor that could never be taken away by defeat. In a world that often celebrates victory above all else, stories like this remind us that true greatness is sometimes found in how we face the inevitable. For us today, whether we are entrepreneurs building something from nothing, creators chasing an idea, or individuals fighting our own personal battles, the lesson still resonates. Courage isn't about certainty. It's about standing firm when the outcome is unclear. Loyalty isn't about convenience. It's about staying true to what matters most. If this story moved you or made you think differently about courage and perseverance, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Masetsura's final stand resonated with you the most? And if you enjoy powerful historical stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey into the past. History is full of incredible moments, and we're just getting started.